Hi everyone. Sorry for appearing via video recording. I'm looking forward to seeing most of you in Denver in just a few days. So, as most of you know, my research focuses on the creation of the American astronaut as a new type of person during the early Cold War. And I do this by exploring a number of pre-NASA human experiments conducted by Air Force space medicine experts in the 1950s. Look west from Denver, and one of the visible snow-capped peaks you'll see is Mount Evans, a 14,000-foot mountain that in 1958 was the site for one of these pre-NASA astronaut tests, an attempt to use nature rather than technology to adapt the human body for life in space. Bruno Balke, a physiologist and avid mountaineer, was one of these space medicine experts employed by the United States Air Force School of Aviation Medicine in San Antonio, Texas. In 1958, he led a team of 6 young soldiers on a 5-week-long trip to live at high altitude near the summit of Mount Evans. The goal was to see if acclimatization to low oxygen levels could maximize the efficiency of humans sealed in space cabin environments. This was part of the new field of space medicine that was started at the school in 1949 by researchers interested in problems of selecting and protecting humans sent into outer space. The environment inside future spacecraft would have to sustain human life, but due to weight restrictions, it could not be an exact replica of Earth. A thinner atmosphere, equivalent to 18,000 feet, with an increased ratio of oxygen was planned. Balke wanted to see if mountains could naturally augment humans to better suit these unnatural conditions. Often, the history of astronauts is told as a history of aviation medicine and the figure of the military test pilot, since this was the pool that NASA ended up selecting the first astronauts, the Mercury 7, from in 1959. This paper looks at another, earlier contributing genealogy for the astronaut, the science of high-altitude physiology and the figure of the nationalistic mountaineer. To do this, I will situate the Mount Evans acclimatization experiment in the context of Balke's earlier altitude research in the mountains of Germany, Tibet, and Peru. The experiment on Mount Evans marks the beginning of a long-standing practice in space medicine of human experiments in analog environments, natural settings seen to simulate some aspect of spaceflight or planetary exploration, low oxygen levels, isolation, sensory deprivation, or geological features. So it's worth knowing how this practice began and came about. High-altitude physiology, Balke's specialty, emerged in late 19th century Europe as part of colonial and nationalistic expeditions to the highest mountains in the world. In the early 20th century, field research piggybacked on highly publicized nationalistic expeditions to India, Nepal, Tibet, and Pakistan. These altitude acclimatization field studies had an important racial character. They were often presented as comparisons between normal sea-level white subjects and altitude-adapted natives from the Andes and the Himalayas. White male bodies were assumed to be normal and the best, but at the same time, high-altitude native bodies were thought to contain clues about how white bodies could be improved upon. Another racial aspect for this research was its total reliance on securing the labor of local porters, sometimes called Sherpas, who were marginalized, infantilized, and considered physically and mentally inferior, and yet expected to follow the European explorers carrying heavier loads. In this way, high-altitude physiology both relied upon and conveyed a complicated politics of nationalism, colonialism, and racialized physical superiority. I'm interested in how concepts of race and the body from mountaineering show up in space medicine and frame the astronaut, an iconic figure of the Cold War, as a new and improved type of human, or as Balke himself put it, quote, a better man than ever. In July 1958, less than 1 year after the Sputnik scare and 3 months before the formal creation of NASA, Bruno Balke took his Air Force team up Mount Evans. Having already completed a 12-week-long fitness program back in Texas, the purpose was to see if this would accelerate their adaptation to altitude. Then, following 5 weeks living on the mountain, Balke wanted to see if this acclimatization improved their ability to function in a sealed space cabin. Mount Evans was selected because it is one of the highest places in America accessible by automobile. The Mount Evans Scenic Byway, built in 1920, is a highway that takes you up to 14,000 feet, an area just below the summit, where you can feel the effects of altitude sickness. This allowed the team to tow a portable pressure chamber that was capable of simulating even higher altitudes. Balke's team first made camp at 10,000 feet, near a high-altitude place called Echo Lake, and resumed their daily workout regimen. Once the team was acclimatized, they camped near the summit and began a daily program of running, carrying heavy loads, and rock climbing, followed by various physiological stress tests conducted inside the mobile pressure chamber. After 5 weeks on the mountain, Balke, along with one other team member, who he considered to be the most fit and the best acclimatized, were sealed together inside a mobile pressure chamber for a period of 10 days to simulate a spaceflight. The ambient atmosphere was set to 14,000 feet, the same as on Mount Evans, and the pair tested their endurance on a stationary bike and pencil and paper mental tests. Balke wrote that, quote, the results from Mount Evans can be applied to the eventual procedures for training and selecting crews for extraterrestrial flight. and that, quote, the first space flyer must be capable of the most exacting human performance and must have the highest degree of tolerance to stress and must have demonstrated endurance to prolonged marginal conditions. Our search, he wrote, is therefore for the qualities of the Superman. This rhetoric of the Superman is repeated elsewhere in Balke's work in space medicine, referring to the need for bodies that can, quote, adapt to superhuman requirements. For Balke, normal humans were just not good enough for these abnormal conditions in space. And here we see a snapshot of a wider Cold War anxiety about the pairing of human bodies and minds with complex systems in newly strategic extreme environments like the Arctic, the desert, tropics, and outer space. Space medicine experts viewed the astronaut as a potentially error-prone system component and worried over how to maximize the reliability of the human factor. For Balke and his Air Force space medicine colleagues, the fear was that a future astronaut might become incapacitated at a critical moment, threatening themselves and the entire system. In addition to this rhetoric of the Superman, Balke's work on high-altitude acclimatization also contained a recurring racialized element. His primary focus was on white males in the military, and their performance at altitude was constantly compared and contrasted with the cardiovascular capacity of altitude-adapted natives from the Peruvian Andes. During the 1950s, Balke made 3 trips to Morococha, Peru, where the Air Force paid to study local natives laboring in high-altitude silver and copper mines. The Air Force forged a long-standing relationship with the Institute for Andean Biology, which provided the Americans access to native populations for experimentation in exchange for grant money and state-of-the-art equipment. This is just one of many examples of the instrumental use of native bodies for American Cold War military research. In his 2007 autobiography, Balke recalls his first trip to the Andes. Quote, the performance capacity of the Andean natives was supposedly much superior to that of any newcomer from the lowlands, and thus they were perhaps ideally suited for eventual extraterrestrial work. In 1959, Balke wrote that, quote, by utilizing the same procedure of gradual ascent as in the Mount Evans experiments, a group of natives reached an average critical altitude of 31,000 feet. The author was still conscious at 33,000 feet. With this sort of comparison, white male sea level subjects are assumed to be the physiological standard or normal, and the deviant bodies of the natives are seen to pose a challenge that Balke points out he can meet and exceed. Publicizing the Mount Evans experiment, Life magazine noted that, quote, scientists of the present are reaching out into our future by learning how to live like the men of tomorrow. This idea that the astronaut was to be this man of tomorrow underlines the stakes of this critical act of person-making. High-altitude natives were implicitly cast in opposition to this future Superman. To understand Balke's notions of race and the body and where they came from, we must look deeper into his biography. Balke was born in 1907 in Braunschweig, Germany, to a family of skiers and mountain climbers. In medical school at Berlin, he spent semester breaks as a mountain guide and a ski instructor in the Alps. However, in 1933, during the course of Balke's medical training, Hitler and the National Socialist Party swept to power, bringing with them a racial ideology advocating German nationalism and physical superiority. Under this new regime, all sports, and mountain climbing in particular, took on a heightened new significance. For European men in the 18th century, mountains became an elite playground for sublime introspection and self-reinvention, a masculine test of endurance and physical fitness, and a proxy arena for heroic nationalistic competition enmeshed in military and colonial activity. For the new German Reich, the nationalistic mountaineering competition brewing in the Himalayas, especially with Britain, was the perfect site to rehabilitate national prestige and psyche so damaged after the loss of World War I. The figure of the struggling, striving, physically exceptional mountaineer proved quite compatible with fascist ideas about German racial superiority. In 1938, Ulrich Luft, one of Balke's well-connected friends from medical school, invited him to join a Nazi-funded expedition to summit Nanga Parbat, one of the tallest and most deadly mountains in Tibet. In 1937, just 1 year prior, Luft had been the only survivor of a disastrous German expedition there. While camped at 20,000 feet, a massive avalanche had crushed the collection of tents, suffocating 16 climbers in their sleep. On the ill-fated 1937 expedition, Ulrich Luft had been assisting in a series of altitude acclimatization experiments for the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, under physiologist Hans Hartmann. Hartmann was among the 16 men killed by the avalanche, but his frozen corpse and notebook filled with data were recovered. It was this study, based off of Hartmann's buried notes, that Balke helped Luft complete for the Luftwaffe on Nanga Parbat in 1938. Like Balke's later work, the application was to increase military pilots' tolerance to altitude, and this study involved comparing blood from the German climbing team with blood taken from Peruvian natives in the Andes. After Balke returned from Nanga Parbat, World War II began, and he joined the German Wehrmacht's 1st Mountain Division as a field physician. Balke participated in the invasion of France, and then in 1941 the invasion of Russia. In 1942, Luft asked Belke to serve as a medical officer at a new high-altitude research facility under construction in the Tyrolean Alps. Here Belke worked on problems of hypoxia and rapid decompressions experienced by German fighter pilots. As Belke recalls, quote, "Fighter pilots were trained under my guidance at the high-altitude station. They were able to exceed the altitude tolerance of non-acclimatized pilots, a great advantage in air battle." This is very similar to the work that he conducted in 1958 on Mount Evans for the United States Air Force. Following the defeat of Nazi Germany, Belke participated in a secret American program run by the CIA called Operation Paperclip, wherein over 1,500 German scientists were invited to continue their work in the United States. About 40 of these scientists were experts in aviation medicine and high-altitude physiology, and despite many of them having connections to lethal human experiments conducted on concentration camp prisoners, they were transferred to San Antonio, Texas, where they formed the first Department of Space Medicine in 1949 under former Luftwaffe head researcher Hubertus Strughold. The Mount Evans acclimatization experiment is one example of the American military's interest in aspects of native bodies during the Cold War. The story of race and astronauts is often told as the story of the civil rights movement in the 1960s and the slow integration of African Americans into the astronaut corps, or contrast between the urban crisis and the massive budgets for Apollo. Likewise, the history of the astronaut body is often told as a history of aviation medicine and the military test pilot. But here we see two different contributing genealogies to the story of race and the astronaut body. Following Belke's work reveals the origins and transfer of these practices from experiments in Germany, Tibet, Peru, to Colorado. To the story of race in the astronaut body, I want to add the figures of the nationalistic mountaineer and the high-altitude native taken from a copper mine and placed in a pressure chamber. Thank you.